there is a memorial at Timber Creek in the Northern Territory made of stone. It stands in memory of the men and horses of the 21st North Australia Observer Unit, who guarded that country from 1942 onwards in the war against Japan. At the bottom of the inscription, after the names and the dates, there is a sentence that the people who built the memorial chose to include because it was the truest thing they could say about what had happened there. 8 words. They come from one of the soldiers who served in the unit. They read, "You always felt safe when you had an Aborigine with you. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of the Nackeroos before today." Because that sentence is not a tribute, it is a confession. It is an admission that the defense of Northern Australia during the Second World War depended on a form of knowledge the Australian Army could not produce through training, could not purchase, could not manufacture, and did not, in the end, adequately pay for. What follows is the story of that knowledge, where it came from, what it made possible, and what was done to the men who carried it. On the 19th of February, 1942, 188 Japanese aircraft arrived over Darwin in 2 waves. They came from 4 aircraft carriers and from land bases in the Celebes. The carrier task force was commanded by the same officer who had directed the attack on Pearl Harbor 10 weeks earlier. The first wave struck at just before 10 in the morning. For 40 minutes, the aircraft bombed the harbor and machine-gunned the ships and the airfields and the town. When it withdrew, a second wave of 54 land-based bombers arrived and continued the work. 235 people were killed. 300 to 400 more were wounded. 9 ships in the harbor were sunk, including the motor vessel Neptuna, whose cargo of 200 depth charges exploded as it lay at the wharf. 30 aircraft were destroyed. The post office took a direct hit, killing the postmaster and his family and 6 young women telegraphists who had sheltered in a slit trench outside. 21 wharf laborers died when a bomb destroyed a section of the jetty during their morning break. The administrator's residence was struck. A young Aboriginal woman who worked for the administrator's family was killed there. Her name is not in the record. More than half of Darwin's civilian population left the area permanently in the days that followed. The military installations that remained were inadequate for the scale of what had come and was expected to come again. Between the 19th of February, 1942, and the 12th of November, 1943, the Japanese mounted more than 80 air raids on Darwin and other Northern Territory airfields. The raids continued for nearly 2 years. Australia did not know, in February 1942, that Japan had no intention of invading the continent. The attacks on Darwin and Broome were not the prelude to a landing. They were designed to neutralize Darwin as a base from which the Allies might contest Japan's seizure of the Netherlands East Indies. Japan's generals had rejected invasion proposals as logistically incoherent. The army dismissed the idea, in the words of its own staff, as gibberish. But Australia's government and people could not know this. Prime Minister John Curtin said on the 16th of February, "The protection of this country is no longer that of a contribution to a world at war, but the resistance to an enemy threatening to invade our own shore." The fear was real. The preparations made under it were real. And the problem those preparations immediately confronted was a geographical one that no amount of fear could solve. The north of Australia was, by any military assessment, ungovernable and unseen. East Arnhem Land was largely unmapped. The coastline stretching from the Kimberley across the Northern Territory to the Gulf of Carpentaria measured thousands of kilometers of mangrove flats, crocodile rivers, flooded plains in the wet season, and waterless stone country in the dry. A Japanese landing force could have come ashore on almost any section of it, and the army would not have known for days. The radar installations were sparse. The garrisons were concentrated in the Darwin area. The country between Darwin and the Queensland border was, for practical military purposes, invisible. The day after the first Darwin raid, a Japanese Zero fighter was shot down over Melville Island, to the north. The pilot survived and crash-landed. He was captured and became the first prisoner of war taken on Australian soil. He was not captured by a soldier, not by a radar operator, or a military policeman, or a member of any organized defense unit. He was captured by a local Aboriginal man who lived on that island. The man's name is not in the record either. The Army needed eyes over a coastline it could not see. The people who could see it, who had lived there, who knew every waterhole and tidal flat and jungle approach, were, by the Army's own law, not soldiers. The Defense Act of 1903, Section 61, Clause H, stated plainly that persons who are not substantially of European origin or descent shall be exempt from service in time of war. The clause had been on the books for nearly 4 decades. It reflected the same assumptions that governed most institutional arrangements surrounding Aboriginal Australians during that period, that Aboriginal people were not citizens in the full sense, did not hold the franchise, and therefore could not be required to accept the obligations of citizenship. The logic, stated in those terms, had a certain internal consistency. Its product, in February 1942, was an army that needed men who knew the North and a law that prevented it from formally enlisting them. The law said the people who could see the country were not soldiers. In January 1942, a man named Herbert John Millera wrote a letter to Prime Minister Curtin. Millera had served in the First World War. He was attempting to enlist again. He reported that he had been told, "We have received orders that no more Aboriginals should be taken in any part of the Australian Army." The letter exists in the National Archives. The orders he describes also exist. Both are in the record. Approximately 300 to 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women enlisted in the armed forces in the first 2 years of the war regardless, navigating a system that officially excluded them through whatever local interpretive generosity individual medical officers chose to apply. By the war's end, the historian Robert Hall's research in the Black Diggers would document approximately 3,000 Aboriginal and 850 Torres Strait Islander people who served in the formal armed forces. They served in the same units as other Australians, sometimes without their commanding officers knowing they were Aboriginal, because formal identification as such would have triggered the exemption. The situation in the North was different. There, the Army could not avoid knowing what it needed or who had it. And there, the official response, documented in a memorandum from the Director of Military Operations, was not an acknowledgement of capability. It was a calculation. The memorandum read, "The costs of services provided by the natives would be repaid in trade: tobacco, fish hooks, wire for fish spears, tomahawks, and pipes." It will be seen that the costs would be very moderate for a plan which would ensure a very comfortable degree of safety to Darwin. That was the official reasoning, not the recognition of skills that no training could replicate, not the acknowledgement of a right to serve. Economy. The defense of Darwin's northern approaches would be very moderate in cost because the men who provided it would be paid in fish hooks. 2 men were chosen to build the units that would patrol the North. Neither had ever commanded soldiers before. Both had spent years in Aboriginal communities, learning what the Army had not thought to ask. One of them would, a quarter-century later, give a name to the structural forgetting that consumed the story he had lived inside. But that is not where this story begins. It begins in Arnhem Land in 1932, when 5 Japanese fishermen were killed at Caledon Bay, and a young anthropologist from Melbourne volunteered to walk into a situation that everyone around him described as suicidal. Donald Finley Ferguson Thompson was born on the 26th of June, 1901, in the Melbourne suburb of Brighton, second child of a Scottish musician and his Welsh-born wife. From Scotch College, he proceeded to the University of Melbourne, where he studied zoology and botany, and then to the University of Sydney for anthropology. In 1928, a grant of £600 from the Australian National Research Council sent him to Cape York Peninsula, where he covered thousands of miles on horseback, taking glass plate photographs and collecting specimens and learning things about the country that no university course had been designed to teach. He was described by the professorial board of the University of Melbourne after his retirement as Australia's Lawrence of Arabia. Thomson would have disliked the comparison, not because it was excessive, but because Lawrence had proved a more pliable instrument of empire than Thomson intended to be. By the early 1930s, he was one of a handful of white Australians who had lived in Arnhem Land, who spoke Yolngu languages, and who had relationships with the clans of the northeast coast, built on years of presence rather than the authority of a government posting. In March 1935, the Commonwealth government sent him back to Arnhem Land as a representative to investigate a crisis that had been building since September 1932. In that month, 5 Japanese Trepangers were killed by Yolngu men at Caledon Bay, in northeast Arnhem Land. In a separate incident the following year, 2 white drifters named Fagan and Traynor were killed on Wooda Island. A police constable named Albert McCall, sent to investigate, was also killed. The circumstances of each killing were contested in the courts and remain contested in the record. Yolngu accounts, confirmed by Thomson's subsequent investigation, established that the killings were responses to specific violations of Yolngu law. The Japanese men had shown contempt for Yolngu women. The police constable had handcuffed a Yolngu woman as part of an attempt to apprehend a suspect and had been killed when her husband came to her defense. The government in Darwin and Canberra did not know these details. What it knew was that Yolngu men had killed 5 Japanese, 2 white Australians, and a police constable, and that the majority of the population of the Northern Territory was Aboriginal. Government documents referred to the need to teach the blacks a lesson. The expedition that nearly happened would have been in the history of frontier violence against Aboriginal Australians, unremarkable in kind and substantial in scale. Thomson volunteered to investigate. He went alone, without weapons, into a community he had not previously visited, by the authority of trust he had not yet established. After 7 months with the Yolngu people, he came back with something now housed in the Buku Larngai Mulka Center at Yirrkala. It was a message stick from Wangu Munungur, the leader of the Japu clan, whose sons were among those imprisoned in Darwin for the killings. The stick was carved with figures of people sitting together, Wangu at the center, keeping the peace. Wangu Munungur was born around 1880 at Caledon Bay. When Thomson first met him, he appeared to be in his 50s, but still, in Thomson's description, in the prime of his life. His sons had gone to prison for defending their women. The government that imprisoned them was asking, through Thomson, for a truce. Wangu sent a message stick. Thomson carried it back. Thomson secured the release of 3 of Wangu's sons and personally returned them to Caledon Bay. He lived for over a year with the Yolngu people, documenting their culture and learning their language, establishing relationships built on the same foundation as the message stick, mutual recognition, honestly held. The historian Henry Reynolds would later describe the Caledon Bay crisis as a decisive moment in the history of Aboriginal European relations. The punitive expedition did not ride. In June 1941, Thomson gave a lecture at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. His subject was Arnhem Land and the native tribes who inhabit that area. In the audience were the Army Chief of Staff and the Director of Military Operations. Thomson showed them what Arnhem Land was and who lived there. He told them what those people could do in that country and what no other force in the Allied order of battle could do in their place. By the end of the lecture, the 2 senior officers understood something about the defense of the northern coast that no strategic assessment had previously captured. The meeting produced a plan. Before the plan could function, one more thing was required, and it was not something the Army could provide, and it was not something Thompson could arrange. It was required from the Yolngu people themselves. The clans Thompson needed were not at peace with each other. This was not a minor administrative complication. The clans of Northeast Arnhem Land maintained their own systems of law, alliance, and enmity. Some of the groups Thompson intended to bring together as a patrol unit were in states of active hostility that predated the Second World War by generations and would not simply be set aside because a white anthropologist in a military uniform asked them to cooperate with an army that had spent the previous century dispossessing their neighbors. The structure that Thompson proposed, men from multiple clans operating together over shared country with a common objective, had a Yolngu form. It was called the Makarata, an ancient ceremony by which warring groups agreed to set aside conflict and act together. Thompson knew it existed. Whether it would happen was not his decision to make. A man named Raiwala Miljingi led the Makarata in 1942. The ceremony united the clans. It was a prerequisite for the unit's formation that no training manual in the Australian Army addressed, that no commanding officer in the Allied forces had considered, and that no military doctrine anticipated. The Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit became operational between the 12th of February and the 19th of March, 1942, because Raiwala Miljingi performed a ceremony whose logic belonged entirely to a culture the Army did not understand. The unit that emerged was unlike anything the Australian Army had produced before or would produce again. Among its 50 Aboriginal personnel, Yolngu men from Northeast Arnhem Land were sons of Wangu Munungur. The same men who had been imprisoned for killing Japanese Trapangers a decade earlier were now prepared to kill Japanese invaders on behalf of the same government that had imprisoned them. 6 Solomon Islanders, a Torres Strait Islander, and several white non-commissioned officers completed the roster. Thompson described the Aboriginal recruits in a report published decades after the war. The men selected were especially fine specimens, he wrote, all people who had grown up in an area where tribal feuds were still carried on, and where guerrilla fighting still plays an important part in their lives. Most of these men were renowned warriors with almost legendary reputations for their prowess as spear fighters. Thompson did not arm them with rifles. The decision was tactical and also revelatory. A man with a rifle in Arnhem Land was identifiable as a soldier, visible to an enemy, classifiable, subject to the laws of war as applied to combatants. A man with a spear was invisible to the same enemy. There was also, beneath the tactical reasoning, something else. These men did not need European weapons. In the country they were being asked to patrol, their existing knowledge was more effective than any rifle could be, because a rifle could not read the terrain, and a man who had grown up on it already could. His base was a ketch called the Arrowetta. The unit moved up and down the Arnhem Land coast, conducting patrols that spanned virtually the entire northeast coastline. They constructed outposts. They built observation positions at points where a landing party would need to pass. One addition combined the ancient and the immediate. Thompson taught them to prepare Molotov cocktails from petrol and glass bottles and rags. He wrote that they proved adept in handling Molotov cocktails and looked forward eagerly to an opportunity of demonstrating their new skill. They went barefoot. They wore no uniforms. They did not look like soldiers, and they did not think of themselves as soldiers. They thought of themselves as men defending their country. A training exercise tells something about what that meant in practice. The unit was required to execute a night approach, to move through difficult terrain in darkness, and reach a rendezvous without being detected. The terrain was a river, mangrove-fringed, mosquito-infested, inhabited by saltwater crocodiles. The men swam it. They arrived at the rendezvous on time. The record notes, without elaboration, that they approached successfully and silently. A man named David Burumara served with the unit on coastal surveillance between Yirkala, Milingimbi, and Elko Island. He was selected because of his knowledge of the local area and because of his ability to survive in the bush. The words that followed in the account, preserved at the Australian War Memorial, are not a tactical assessment. They are a statement of capacity that the Army spent the entire war struggling to articulate. Traditional people know bushcraft, so they are able to get by with very little. Thompson, for his part, noted from experience that his Aboriginal men were generally more contented than whites in the field. They do not grouch or become bloody-minded, he wrote, and are more easily handled. This observation, made by the man who recruited them without wages and who retained the authority to dismiss them, sits in the record alongside the documented fact of their unpaid service and their fishhook compensation. Thompson meant it as praise. The record holds both things simultaneously and does not resolve the contradiction. 320 kilometers to the west and south in the Stone Country and the dry river valleys of the Territory interior, a different anthropologist was building a different unit from the same foundation. William Edward. Hanley Stanner was born at Watson's Bay, Sydney, on the 24th of November, 1905. He had studied at the University of Sydney, worked as a journalist, and conducted anthropological field research in Northern Australia and in East Africa in the 1930s. By early 1942, he was serving as personal assistant to the Minister for the Army, Frank Ford, in Canberra. His appointment to command what became the 21st North Australia Observer Unit was described by other military officers as radical, because he had never held a military command. The Army took a different view. What Stanner possessed, and what no officer on the Army's roster could match, was a decade of knowledge of the country and its people. That was what the command required. Stanner named his unit's philosophical foundations precisely: time, space, physical movement, and supply. The model he drew on was not the Western Front or the Pacific campaigns unfolding to the north. He had studied the Boer Commando during his field research in East Africa, and he had studied the German Army's campaign in East Africa during the First World War, where fewer than 14,000 German soldiers, with detailed knowledge of local terrain, had effectively contained more than 160,000 British troops across 4 years. Small groups, high mobility, local knowledge. The landscape is a weapon, if you understood it, or a trap, if you did not. Formed on the 11th of May, 1942, with its headquarters in Katherine, the 21st North Australia Observer Unit numbered approximately 550 men at its peak, among them 59 Aboriginal personnel employed as guides. Stanner asked the Northern Territory Police Force for officers and their police trackers precisely because their knowledge of the bush and their experience of living in the isolated territory were prerequisites for the patrols he planned, not supplements to some other capability. The distinction mattered. The Aboriginal guides were not attached to the unit as auxiliaries. They were the reason the patrols could function at all. The transport was horses, donkeys, mules, trucks, and 8 boats under 15 meters. The armament was leftover rifles, shotguns, small amounts of firearms from different countries, and whatever you could bring yourself. The conditions were isolation, flies, crocodile attacks, mosquitoes, hunger, thirst, sometimes only Morse code to communicate with headquarters, and the knowledge that they were expendable. The men built their own shelters. They broke and trained their own horses. They hunted food in country that, to a soldier from Victoria or Queensland's coast, looked like nothing at all. Peter Huskins had been a bank clerk at the Bank of New South Wales before he signed up at the age of 19. He joined the Nackeroos because the unit existed and the war was happening, and he was young enough to think that was sufficient reason. In the north, he found a world for which nothing in his education had prepared him. The units relied heavily on Aboriginal trackers for tracking, for survival, for food, for medicinal treatments that the bush produced a need for in men who had not spent their lives in it. The testimony Huskins gave in his oral history, recorded for the Australian War Memorial in 1991, is matter-of-fact in the way that testimony about things learned through survival tends to be. It was not that the trackers were helpful. It was that, without them, the patrols could not survive. The knowledge that made the difference was not reducible to a single skill. It was systemic, accumulated over generations of living in specific country, attending to it, naming it, understanding its moods and its seasons and its silences. A tracker read a waterhole the way a European soldier read a map, with the understanding that what it told you right now was different from what it had told you yesterday and would tell you tomorrow. A track in the dust was a text. How many people had passed? How recently? How fast? Carrying weight or not? Moving toward water or away from it? Belonging to a community that knew this ground, or a party that did not? The silence in a section of bush, the specific quality of a silence that was wrong for the time of day, was information of a kind that no field manual had ever described, because no field manual had been written by someone who had learned to hear it. One patrol operating out of Roper River in 1942 to 1943, guided by Aboriginal men who knew the country, found Japanese oil drums near Blue Mud Bay. The drums had been cached on that remote coastline before the war, evidence of pre-war Japanese reconnaissance that no European patrol unit could have located in that terrain without guidance. The record notes the find. It does not quantify what it took to reach the place where the find was made. The memorial at Timber Creek records the conclusion that the men who survived drew from everything they experienced in that country. 8 words from one of those men. You always felt safe when you had an Aborigine with you. Not that the Aboriginal guides were useful. Not that they were skilled. Safe. The person who chose that word knew exactly what it meant. The question of what those men were owed was being answered, while the patrols ran in official documents that did not present it as a question at all. The Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit patrolled the most remote and strategically exposed coastline in Australia during the period of maximum Japanese threat. Its members received no wages. Payment was in trade goods, fish hooks, wire, tobacco, tomahawks. This was not an oversight or an administrative failure. It was the policy, stated explicitly in the Director of Military Operations Memorandum, justified as economy, and maintained for the duration of the unit's operation. The men who swam the Crocodile River in darkness and approached the rendezvous successfully and silently were not soldiers by the legal definition of the Defense Act. No service number existed in the paperwork that determined pensions, benefits, and land grants. The memorandum's framing was precise. Natives whose costs would be moderate. The Aboriginal guides of the 21st North Australia Observer Unit operated under marginally different terms, but their formal status was similarly outside the structures that governed pay and recognition. Listed as laborers, the category was accurate under the legislation. It was not accurate about the work. When the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit disbanded in April 1943, as the war moved northward, and other forces expanded to take over the surveillance role, and when the Nackeroos were stood down in March 1945, the men who had served in them went home. The country they went home to was the same country they had left. The Protection Acts were still in force. State governments still controlled where Aboriginal people could live, move, and work. The franchise was withheld. Wages in equivalent jobs remained unequal by law. For soldiers who had served in integrated units, the approximately 3,000 who had enlisted in the regular forces, the return was complicated by the same discriminatory structures in a different form. War Service Land Settlement granted returned service personnel land grants. Aboriginal veterans were not formally excluded. In practice, access was denied in case after case, sometimes because land farmed before the war had been redistributed to non-Aboriginal settler families while they were away. The government closed the Lake Conda Aboriginal Reserve and gave it to non-Indigenous soldier settlers. The record holds this. It does not note the irony. Gary Oakley, the Indigenous Liaison Officer at the Australian War Memorial, has put the matter in terms the documentation supports. We're not citizens, yet we're willing to die for this place. We're willing to die for non-Indigenous Australians. Have a think about that one. For the members of the Northern Territory, Special Reconnaissance Unit specifically, formal recognition wasn't delayed. It was absent. The Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion received retrospective medals and recognition during the 1980s. Similar payments and service medals for Aboriginal soldiers elsewhere were not awarded until as late as 1994. For the surviving members of the Northern Territory, Special Reconnaissance Unit, acknowledgement came in 1992. The back pay was awarded. 2 members of the unit remained alive to receive it. 2 men. 50 years. Fishhooks. The Defence Act clause classifying Aboriginal Australians as exempt from wartime service, the same clause that had made them not soldiers for 5 decades, was removed from the legislation in 1992. The same year the back pay was awarded. The record holds these facts in sequence. That is where the commentary belongs. The man who commanded the Nackeroos came home from the war, returned to anthropology, and spent the next 3 decades arguing for the rights of the people whose knowledge had made his unit survivable. After 1945, Stanner became one of the most influential voices in Australian public life on Indigenous affairs. In 1967, Prime Minister Harold Holt invited him to help form the Commonwealth Council for Aboriginal Affairs, alongside Herbert Coombs and Barry Dexter. Stanner advised successive governments through the Whitlam years. In 1975, when the Whitlam government made the first formal return of land to the Gurindji people at Waddy Creek, Stanner recommended the symbolic act that has since become one of the defining images of that moment. The Prime Minister pouring soil through his fingers into the hand of Gurindji elder Vincent Lingiari. In 1968, Stanner delivered the annual Boyer Lectures on Australian National Radio. The lectures were titled, After the Dreaming. The argument that is carried furthest came in the first lecture, where he described a phenomenon that could not, he said, be explained by absent-mindedness. He called it the Great Australian Silence. It was a structural matter, a view from a window which has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of the landscape. What may well have begun as a simple forgetting of other possible views turned under habit, and over time, into something like a cult of forgetfulness practiced on a national scale. During the war years, Australia had sharply reduced its coverage of Aboriginal affairs. Articles and letters which were published tended not to report the Aboriginal contribution to the war effort. A generation of Australians followed the Second World War in daily newspaper accounts, the Middle East campaigns, the fall of Singapore, the Kokoda Track, the naval battles of the Pacific, and were offered, during those years, almost nothing about what was happening on their own northern coast, or who was watching it. The patrols ran. The oil drums were found. The mangrove rivers were swum in darkness. None of it entered the newspapers. None of it became, in the way that daily newspaper accounts become, a part of what people remember as the shape of the war. The absent Stanner named in 1968 was already complete by the time he named it. The window had been carefully placed. The Nackeroos and the Northern Territory. Special Reconnaissance Unit were on the excluded quadrant's far edge, not suppressed in any active sense, not classified or deliberately hidden, but outside the frame through which the war had been made visible to the country that fought it. What the press did not report, the commemorative culture did not commemorate. What the commemorative culture did not commemorate, the national curriculum did not teach. Stanner called it a cult of forgetfulness. He was describing the mechanism. He was also, without naming them, describing what had happened to the men he had commanded and the men they had relied upon. The Army forgot. The Army also eventually remembered. In the late 1970s, Australian defense strategy was reconsidered. The withdrawal from Vietnam had ended the era of forward defense, the doctrine by which Australia's security rested on military commitments in Southeast Asia. The new policy was continental defense. Australia would protect its own territory, and the territory it most needed to protect was the territory it had always been least able to see. The North, the Kimberley, the Territory, the Gulf country, the same expanse of coastline and interior that had presented the identical strategic problem in 1942. The Army's answer, on the 1st of July, 1981, was the Northwest Mobile Force, NORFORCE. It was formed from the 7th Independent Rifle Company and based in Darwin. Its designation was Regional Force Surveillance Unit, one of 3 that would eventually cover the North. Its area of operations, 1.8 million square kilometers, taking in the Northern Territory and the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the largest operational area of any military unit in the world today. NORFORCE officially adopted the orange and green double diamond color patch of the 1st North Australia Observer Unit. Not as decoration, the adoption was a formal statement of lineage. This unit comes from that unit. The traditions are continuous, the knowledge is the same knowledge, and 60% of NORFORCE's personnel are Aboriginal soldiers, recruited primarily from the communities within the area they patrol, because the knowledge of country that makes those patrols possible still cannot be manufactured through training, and still resides in the people who have lived in that country across generations. The reasoning in 1981 was structurally identical to Stanner's reasoning in 1942. The Army had arrived at the same conclusion twice. 2 additional Regional Force surveillance units were raised in 1985, the Pilbara Regiment in Western Australia and the 51st Battalion, Far North Queensland Regiment. The Pilbara Regiment carries as its regimental motto a Western Desert phrase, Mintu Wanta, always alert. The first time an Indigenous language has been incorporated into an Australian Defence Force regimental crest. The Army that paid for its northern defence in tobacco and fish hooks in 1942 had taken 4 decades to reach the point of writing an Indigenous language into an official emblem. In September 2022, NORFORCE led ceremonies in the eastern Arnhem Land communities of Remengur and Gapuiak to mark the 80th anniversary of the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit's formation. More than 30 descendants of original unit veterans now serve in NORFORCE. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Medlin, the unit's commanding officer, spoke at the ceremonies. This is an important, but largely unknown piece of Australian military history, he said, where Aboriginal people came together with the Australian Army to defend our nation. He said largely unknown. In 2022, 80 years after Raiwala Miljingi led the Makarrata that made the unit possible, the commanding officer of the modern unit that carries its lineage described the story as largely unknown. The window Stanner named in 1968 was still there. The ceremonies in Remengur and Gapuiak were the view from the other side. The accounting that remains is this: 50 Aboriginal men, most of them Yolngu from northeast Arnhem Land, patrolled the coastline of Australia during the period of maximum Japanese threat, using spears and knowledge of country accumulated across more time than the Army had existed. 550 Nackeroos rode through the Kimberley and the Territory interior, surviving in terrain that defeated every assumption they had arrived with, because Aboriginal trackers showed them how to read water and tracks, and the particular quality of a silence that was wrong for the time of day. A Yolngu man named Raiwala Miljingi performed a ceremony that united warring clans and made a unit possible that no military planning had anticipated. A Japanese Zero pilot was captured on Melville Island by a man whose name the record did not preserve. Japanese oil drums were found near Blue Mud Bay by a patrol that could not have reached that country without guides who had spent their lives in it. Donald Finlay Ferguson Thompson walked into Arnhem Land in 1935, alone and unarmed, carrying the authority of nothing except a willingness to listen, and came back with a message stick that stopped a massacre and built a friendship that would, 7 years later, produce the most unconventional military unit Australia deployed in the Second World War. Wounded in New Guinea, he came home to a university and an OBE and a professorship, and the quiet, persistent advocacy of a man who knew what he had seen in the North and found that his country was not much interested in knowing it. He died at his farm in Eltham on the 12th of May, 1970. William Edward Hanley Stanner commanded the Nackeroos and relied, for his unit's survival, on the knowledge of men the Army classified as laborers. He came home and spent 20 years arguing for the rights of those men and their communities. And in 1968, he named the mechanism by which everything he had witnessed had been made to disappear. He was right about the cult. He was right about the forgetfulness. He died on the 8th of October, 1981, 3 months after NORFORCE was formed, carrying the color patch of the unit he had once commanded. Wangu Munungur was born around 1880 at Caledon Bay. His sons were imprisoned for killing Japanese Trapangers in 1932. Thompson returned those sons to him in 1936. In 1942, those same sons served in the unit Thompson built, prepared to kill Japanese invaders on behalf of the government that had imprisoned them for killing Japanese a decade before. Wangu died in 1959. He had lived to see his country defended by his children in conditions that the government declined to formally acknowledge. 2 members of the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit remained alive in 1992 when the back pay was finally awarded. The Defense Act clause that had made them not soldiers for 50 years was removed from the legislation the same year. The Nackeroo Memorial at Timber Creek does not call them soldiers. It calls them trackers. It says that men and horses guarded this country, and that Aboriginal trackers helped those men survive in this harsh environment. And then it says the thing that one of those men said, which is truer than any military citation or official history or commemorative ceremony that has since been built around this service. You always felt safe when you had an Aborigine with you. That sentence was placed on a stone because the men who had been in the North wanted it remembered. Not the strategy, not the order of battle or the chain of command or the intelligence assessments or the diplomatic calculations that had sent them there. The feeling of safety that a particular kind of knowledge produced in a particular kind of country. The feeling that what you were walking through was being read by someone who had always known how to read it. Stanner said the Great Australian Silence was a view from a window carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of the landscape. He was describing something that happened to history. He was also, without naming them, describing what had happened to these men and their service. This story has tried to point at what the window was placed to exclude. Raiwala Miljingi led the Makarrata in 1942. More than 30 of his descendants carry rifles and patrol that same country today under the double diamond color patch of the unit that came from the unit Stanner built. That is the continuity the memorial at Timber Creek was made to honor. That is what didn't get lost, even inside the silence. If you had a family member who served in the North, with the Nackeroos, with the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit, with NORFORCE, or in any of the communities that kept watch over that coastline and said nothing in the newspapers because no newspapers were reporting it, say so in the comments. This history belongs to the people who carried it. The memorial at Timber Creek says, "You always felt safe when you had an Aborigine with you." The stone has said it for decades. The question was whether the country was paying attention.